Welcome to Academia Sinica Lecture. Today our invited speaker is Dr. Charles Taylor. Now let's welcome the Vice President of Academia Sinica, Dr. Fan Shen Wang, to deliver the welcome remarks. Let's welcome Dr. Wang.
Professor Taylor, Mrs. Taylor, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to introduce to you Professor Charles Taylor to deliver this year's Academia Sinica Lecture. Professor Charles Taylor is one of the most prominent and influential philosophers in the world today. He is currently Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at McGill University in Canada, known for his contribution to political philosophy, the philosophy of social science, the history of philosophy, and intellectual history. Professor Taylor is the author of more than 20 books and 500 articles, translated into 20 languages. His work have ranged from reflection on epistemology, an idea of holistic liberalism, which can overcome the atomistic individualism inherent in liberal theory of John Rawls, to analysis of mutual recognition in contemporary multicultural societies. He has been awarded many prestigious prizes and honors, including the Krugge Prize in 2015, in recognition of his exceptional contribution to the scientific, cultural, and spiritual betterment of mankind. Professor Taylor was educated at McGill University and as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. He began his professional career as a fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and then as a professor at McGill University and Cicelli Professor of Social and Political Theory at Oxford. His first major work, The Explanation of Behavior, 1964, took aim at behaviorism and probes the explanation of our actions. These were issues that would continue to preoccupy his philosophy. In his seminal work, Sources of Self, The Making of Modern Identity, 1989, he argues that humans are self-interpreting animals and survey Western ethical history to reveal a succession of moral visions which constitute the source of human actions. He concluded that by suggesting that secular source of inspiration alone may not be able to sustain important values, such as universal benevolence, over the long run. Professor Taylor has espoused a revival of spirituality in the modern world, as it holds the most promise for maintaining the moral order of a society. Many people assume that modern society and religious spirituality are incompatible, but Professor Taylor, however, has explored the possibility throughout his work that there may be different ways to be modern, or multiple modernities. Professor Taylor has been concerned not solely with abstract issues, but with key intellectual problems for modern democratic society. In his work, A Secular Age, published in 2007, he asked, what is secularism? And what does it mean to live in a secular society? In the same year, Professor Taylor was awarded the Templeton Prize, the most prestigious prize in the world of religions. Professor Taylor's work spanned many academic disciplines and has contributed to broad philosophical discourses. His breadth of study, consistency of arguments, accessibility, and pertinence for contemporary issues have won him an audience not only among students and professionals in philosophy, political science, religious study, and other social sciences, but also among the general public. I want to once again express a special word of gratitude to Professor Charles Taylor for accepting our invitation to be the Academia Sinica Lecture of 2016. During his stay in Taiwan, Professor Taylor will give 2 lectures. The topic of his lecture today is the crisis of Western democracy. His second lecture, entitled How to Understand Secularism, will be delivered tomorrow afternoon at the College of Social Science at Taiwan University, 台大社科院，明天下午。Before Professor Taylor gives his lecture, I would like to invite him to come up to the stage to receive a special gift in honor of him as the Academia Sinica Lecture.
Good. So thank you very much, Professor Wang, and for the very, very laudatory, very positive introduction, but also for this wonderful gift that you just gave me, which reflects the past of Taiwan and the great work done by your archaeological and historical society here. So I want to talk about the crisis in Western democracy. And maybe some of you might think, what crisis? What's the problem? Is there really a crisis in Western democracy? So in order to explain what I mean by this, I'd like to have a look at some of the more general concepts we're going to be using here. And the first is democracy itself. So democracy is easy to define. People say it's a regime in which the people rules. But that's not as unproblematic as it looks. This concept of ruling, when it's applied in some cases to some subjects, it's pretty clear what it means. But when it's applied to the people, it's not. I mean, for instance, if I want to say that under some monarchy or some dictatorship, the dictator rules, it's fairly clear what we mean by that, and it's fairly clear how to verify it, right? That this person has the power to make the major decisions and impose them. Even the notion of people ruling can be quite unproblematic in the concept of small face-to-face societies like certain Swiss cantons where all the men, the recently admitted women, but the men got together and they raised their sticks and to vote on something, or the Greek polis, of course, where the whole membership of the polis could come together and vote. And a majority vote there plainly was, in some clear sense, the people ruling. But when you get to most modern states, large-scale societies like yours or mine, the only way that we can bring it about that the people rule is through some rather complex system of representation, very often balance of power, very often safeguards for the validity of this representation, very complex. And that means that we can introduce a doubt in our minds. Yes, this system is meant to produce really the people ruling, people deciding, but in fact, the way it actually works out, there are all these elites that can in various ways get control of and confiscate the process, for instance, by immense application of money to politics and so on. So that, although on the face of it, it's supposed to be the people ruling, it isn't really. So that means that there is just inherent in the nature of the notion of democracy applied to large societies, the possibility of doubt, of skepticism, of asking oneself, is this really a democracy? And that's one very important point I want to hang over our thinking here, because it's exactly that which introduces a whole set of very important issues. Now, another way of coming at this point about what doubts can be about and what they represent for democracy is to take up a very common view in the West in the last, really century or half century, the idea that the world is progressing, the world is getting democratic, that now this group of societies are democracies. Later on, a larger group will be democracies. Later on, even larger group, and that there will be no backsliding. So democracy proceeds, marches down towards ultimate universality. You can probably guess that I'm very skeptical of this view. And it's precisely in the light of this skepticism, which connects with the skepticism about various, as it were, representations or manifestations of democracy, that the issue arises. Maybe some democracies can be in crisis. So let me try to describe the idea of democracy that people have when they have this very strong, confident, glowing feeling that democracy is marching forward. And it's something like the following. First of all, that democracy consists of the rule of law. I mean, an essential feature of democracy is the rule of law. And secondly, that what it means to have a democracy is not that we don't have, in fact, elites ruling at any given moment, the same elites, maybe technical elites, maybe political elites, maybe economic elites, are actually running the show, making the decisions. But on this view, what democracy introduces is periodic votes by the entire citizen body, which can throw out the existing team of elite rulers and substitute another one. And this very fact that they can be thrown out keeps them honest, keeps them focused on the popular interest. So this is the picture of democracy I want to call Schumpeterian. The famous Joseph Schumpeter was one of the most voluble and interesting proponent of this as democracy. Democracy is where you have competition between elites for the confidence of the people and therefore for the right to rule. And the crucial point is that they have maybe 4 years, 5 years, and then they have to face the people again. Now, you can see why this view of democracy could create this sense of confidence that democracy is on the march. Because on this view of democracy, this is really the most stable regime. Why a stable regime? Well, first of all, because if there's the rule of law, at least you know where you stand, and what can be done and what can't be done. And secondly, because if you are in this situation, you have confidence that in the end, your interests will be taken into account, even if the present elites are not paying you any attention, they could lose power. So we have this idea that democracy is marching forward, partly because it's seen in the terms I've just described, but partly because, and this reflection has some truth to it, as traditional regimes, traditional forms of power begin to get loosened up, begin to find some of their people beginning to doubt them, beginning to lose some legitimacy, you get potentially great instability in these transition societies which are moving away from traditional forms. And it would look like the only way to restore that stability is to move over to democracy. So democracy is the solution to a problem, the problem of the instability of traditional legitimacy, which is bound to increase as we move ahead. It follows from all this that not only will democracy move forward, but it won't move backward, right? Because having arrived at this haven of stability, there's no reason why we should call that into question and move away from democracy. So you have a picture of democracy which, if you just take those trays there, it makes it look as though, yeah, it could be the future. Now, of course, we look at what's actually going on, and we find a lot of backsliding. Things go forward, things go back. We had at the end, for instance, of the Soviet world and the power of the Soviet Union, the fall of the wall. In 1989, we had a raft of new democracies, not only in Eastern Europe, but actually you found some in Africa and elsewhere. But 20 years later, 25 years later, some of these are no longer staying the course. They've slid back. I mean, the case of Russia itself is perhaps the most telling case here. So there's a matter of some steps forward and some steps back. Now I want to focus on steps back. What is it? There is such a thing I want to say as democratic decay. I mean, good, functioning democracies that somehow slip away from that. So what is the nature of democratic decay and how does it come about? And here's the crucial justification of my title. Is it now coming about among Western democracies? And I'm going to argue that it is. Right? So it's in this face of this possibility of what I call democratic decay, or let's say democratic regression, that I want us to place our understanding of what's going on. In order to see what democratic decay could amount to, I want to introduce another concept of democracy, not the Schumpeterian one, not the one which defines it by rule of law and by the possibility of throwing the rascals out of an election, throwing out the existing elites. And indeed, this conception has in common with the first one the notion that the rule of law is central to modern democracy. But it differs from it in its understanding of what people ruling amounts to. And in order to get this concept out, I have to bring out a basic, it's not exactly ambiguity, but a basic, if you like, polysemy, double meaning of the word people in most modern European languages, and I think probably this is matched in Chinese and other languages. The people can mean the ensemble of human beings who make up the society or who are old enough to be citizens or what have you. And that's, of course, the idea behind the Schumpeterian. They're the people who can vote and throw the government out or bring it back in. But the people also means, and this is in the very word democracy, the people in the sense of the Greek word demos, which is not the whole, but let's call it this way, the non-elite part of the whole. It's taken for granted by the use of the word demos, in Latin plebs, right? That the society is stratified, that there are people that have, as it were, starting off certain privileges or possibility of privileges, class, birth, aristocracy, wealth, and so on, which could give them disproportionate power. And democracies mean, in the ancient Greek sense, that as against the government being dominated by the powerful, it's on the contrary dominated by the demos. So let's speak of non-elites here in all kinds of dimensions. Non-elites in terms of property, non-elites in terms of class and nobility and so on and so on. Democracy is the rule of the people in this second sense, means that the demos, the non-elites, really call the shots. And that's how Aristotle, as you know, saw it, right? That democracy was, indeed, he wasn't very keen on democracy because it was just like oligarchy, it was too one-sided. One class, as it were ruling. And until 100 and so, a couple of centuries perhaps at most, in the West, the word democracy carried this original sense, which is why the founders of the American Constitution weren't Democrats. They were Republicans. That is, they wanted a balanced regime in which there would be the guarantee against rule by certain narrow factions, but not democracy. They saw democracy still as kind of one of the forms that class war can take, namely one where the non-elites win out, right? So we have this earlier conception of democracy, which of course, in that conception, democracy is far from the most stable form of government. It's a government that is always in danger of being turned back or having to fight against another regime. But what are we to make of this double meaning, which is so anchored in our parlance in the modern world that we just can't get rid of it? Sometimes we mean the people rules in the sense of everybody. We all have the right to vote, for instance. Sometimes we mean, well, the people, the non-elites, really have their say in ruling. If I could put it this way, the difference between the two is that in both our cases of the people ruling in the first sense, that is, all the citizens vote, but in one of these cases, there are all sorts of obstacles to the non-elites having their proportionate say, right? They are various ways in which power can be captured en route to reaching legislative and governmental results to the effect that the majority of the non-elites are really given a much lesser role. Right? So what is this second conception of democracy which involves playing between these two concepts of people? And I want to call it the telic conception. Now, telic is a new word I'm introducing here, but you see it comes from the Greek word telos, or goal or purpose. It's an idea which sees democracy as something that can only be realized when a certain condition is brought about, which is not always there. And that condition is where, if you like, people in one sense equals people in the other sense, in the sense that the people as a whole ruling is shorn of, goes beyond any particular filtering processes, which in fact end up with the demos, with the common people, with the non-elites having less influence, having really less voice. Right? That's the goal. This democracy is something that we're always aiming at on this view. And we achieve it by undoing and overcoming all the mechanisms by which the non-elites have a disproportionately small influence on what actually comes about. Right? So when I said, you see what I mean by a telic conception. It's a conception of how democracy could really be democracy, how regimes which all are democracies in the first Schumpeterian sense, because everybody votes and so on, can be really democracies as against very mitigated and very imperfect democracies. The second point to make about this telic conception is that it recognizes that the direction of development is not in one way only. It's not that over time we gradually undo all these mechanisms and we manage to more and more approach the perfect point where everybody has the same kind of influence on the outcome, regardless of whether they're elites or non-elites. On the contrary, we can have movements towards and then followed by movements away from this, and that's what I want to call democratic decay. Right? Democratic decay, or democratic regression, is a concept that only makes sense in terms of this telic view of democracy. Right? Because, I mean, perhaps you might even say that perfect democracy is almost a utopia. We're never quite there. There's always some important imbalances. But we could think of our development as taking place along a gamut, either moving more and more and more towards an ultimate point where there would be real equality of influence, the demos would not be in any way disadvantaged, or moving backwards, the needle goes back farther and farther, and we get a situation in which the non-elites are more and more shunted aside, more and more ignored, and so on. And if you look at our history, you can see that the very possibility of arriving at the proper telic point and never sliding back is utterly unrealizable. It's unrealistic. Why? Well, because our situation is always changing. The structure of the society, the sociology of the society, the ways in which people make their living in the society, and so on, are changing in history, and they pose new problems of potential elite rule, which have to be undone, even when you thought you'd solved the older problems. Let's quickly just look at, starting with the United States, but moving through the Western cases in general, at how we've been going back and forth. See, the American Revolution was elite led. They were people, elite led. They were led by people like Washington and Jefferson, in some cases who owned big properties and slaves, but in other cases were definitely middle class leaders and so on. But very early on in the 19th century, you get, well, first of all, the election of Jefferson's, they were then called Republicans, but they're the ancestors of the Democrats, and by Jackson later on pushing this even farther, in which you got a substantial reestablishment of equality. The interests of the non-elites began to be reflected in government. So let's say from 1776 until 1840 or 50, you have this kind of movement towards greater equality. The needle goes towards the right end of the spectrum where we get to the goal. But then the economy is totally transformed by the development of large-scale industry, and you get at the end of the 19th century the era of the robber barons, the large industrialists who broke unions and colluded with each other and gained a tremendous amount of power. And the whole issue of which way the needle is going was transformed because there were new kinds of sources of elite power now, namely large-scale industry as against large landowning. And so you get the needle moving in that direction, the bad direction. Incidentally, Tocqueville already in Democracy in America, looking at his experience of England, where this industry was developing, already said, the equality at present achieved in Western societies could be rolled back by this new kind of elite power. All right, then the story gets not bad again, because from the 1930s on, the New Deal of Roosevelt, with the development of welfare states in the other European or Western societies during the war, after the war, and so on, you get, in fact, the balance going back. You get the creation of trade unions, of cooperatives, of redistributive mechanisms like the welfare state, and so on. And incidentally, if you want to look at this through the prism of equality of income and equality of wealth, these periods where we're going towards the goal are periods when wealth differences get squeezed and more narrow. And the other periods are periods when very clearly wealth differences of income get much bigger. Well, the story, from up to about the Second World War to 1975, it was in this phase of moving towards greater equality. And then we go the other way in the West, and indeed in world economy in general. And we have, as you know, galloping inequality now with new transformations, like the tremendous power of financial institutions and so on to command wealth and so on. Parallel to the growth of the industry and the robber barons a century earlier, we get this. You see, we're not dealing with something where we would come to some beautiful haven, Rousseau devised haven of small farmers all talking to each other on a level of equality. We're dealing with societies which are constantly being transformed, and where the issues of equality, the issues of elite power, the issues of how to undo elite power occur again and again. So now, in order to see how democratic decay, I would argue that the period from, let's say, 1975 on, roughly speaking, is a period in which, in Western democracies, the needle has been moving back in the bad direction. And we're moving farther away from the telos, from the goal, from what would really make democracy. Incidentally, something we might have in the back of our minds here is that one of the proofs that a lot of people are living their democracy in terms of this telic conception is the way in which periods where things are moving towards that goal are periods of much more powerful and enthusiastic popular participation as measured for example, by voting levels. And periods where we're moving away are periods when you get disaffection, sense, oh, it's no use, what's the bother, voting gets you nowhere, all politicians are the same, kind of things that you hear perhaps in this society as well. And sort of the level of democratic energy goes down, right? So you get societies that are very, very, very different in terms of the actual level of inequality, like India today and Western European societies in the 1950s, right? Which, strangely enough, are both periods of high popular energy not because India today is as equal as, let's say, France or Britain of 1950, but because there's a sense in India of a possible movement. So you get extraordinary things Indian political scientists tell us about voting there that, whereas in our societies, and I'll ask you later which is true of yours, in our society, the richer you are, the more educated you are, the more middle class you are, the more you vote. And the poorer and so on, the less you vote. India is the other way around. That low caste, women is against men, poor vote at a higher proportion than rich Brahmins in Delhi. And this is because there is this tremendous, it's a wonderful book by, what's her name is Banerjee, and I'll remember her name later on, why India votes, which she's a anthropologist who did work with electorates and so on. Why do they feel they have to vote? Why are they so excited about it? And you get this sense emerging. All right, so what I want to look at is the causes of democratic decay and what can be, if anything, what can be done about it. Well, let's look at these in terms of what I want to call the conditions of the social imaginary. This is a hard concept to explain very quickly, but I mean to say that any society, democratic or non-democratic, there are a certain number of key practices that people have to carry out together in order to realize that form of society. Now, in a democracy, people have to form parties, they have to form movements that will agitate and push the debate in this or that direction. They have to participate in voting and so on. So the social imaginary is an attempt to describe how people imagine their society. It's more than just the theory, the spontaneous way they respond, the kind of stories that they tell, the way that people in common imagine their society, such that these actions, these common practices make sense to them. Right? I mean, there are examples of this making sense or not making sense. In our modern Western democracies, we go on election day and each one of us goes into the booth and marks an X or a tick against the candidate, and then all this is added up. And all this amounts to a collective decision, in this case to give the government to this gang or to that gang on the basis of that program as against that program. Now, that took a long time to develop. That is, a situation in which that makes sense as a collective decision. I mean, you could say, well, why should it make sense to me as a collective decision when all these other people just happen to outnumber me and my people who vote like me? Why should I take that as legitimate? And there are some societies in history, for most of the time, I mean, there are early societies, small societies in which the collective decision consists of the elders getting together and talking and talking and talking and talking until they get some kind of consensus. And from their point of view, to see a society which very vigorously divides itself, and this gang is saying, those are crooks, they're wrong, don't vote for them, vote for me, and so on. And then counting votes and that counts as a collective decision. No, I mean, this is a way of tearing your society apart, right? So the development of a social imaginary where that kind of thing makes sense to people is something that requires a long development in history. It doesn't just come by itself. Now, one of the features of the social imaginary of democracies in the modern sense is something very subtle. It is the legitimation of conflict. Right? There has to be a legitimation of conflict. If you don't have a legitimation of conflict, then you get a veiled or not so veiled authoritarian society saying, we don't have to fight about this, so stop protesting, stop attacking other people, right? So you get the legitimation of conflict, but it has to remain within certain limits. You can see this, for instance, if you look at another feature of a democracy, the legitimation of partisan demonstrations. I mean, partisan not in the sense of for a party, but for one measure as against another. It can be demonstrations for gay rights, or demonstrations for women's rights, or demonstrations for one party. But in all of these cases, you have an activity where there's a lot of aggression and criticism and hostility expressed, but it stays this side of actual violence. In other words, the democratic demonstration has got to remain a speech act rather than an act of physical power, right? And of course, one of the problems with these demonstrations is always that some fringe comes and begins to smash windows and so on, and then you delegitimate very radically the whole movement by that. See? So it's something very hard to understand in societies that are used to social harmony, above all, as the norm, as the good. You can see they understand what it is to break social harmony and start attacking each other, but doing that without actually attacking, that requires a quite different social imaginary. Now, so there are lots of other features of the social imaginary, but I think I'm going to run out of time if I go into all of them now. I mean, the social imaginary necessary for democracy. I mean, people have to have a sense that they belong to a people together. Otherwise, you get Libya. Okay, get rid of Gaddafi. And people think, the Libyan people will get together and they'll just have an election, and this group will be, but that's not what happened. Because a lot of people in Libya didn't feel, Libyan people, what's that? I mean, Libya was just created out of the Ottoman Empire through the Italians taking it over in 1911, and then it was, became independent when the Italians lost the Second World War, and then Gaddafi seized power. But people living in Benghazi and people living in Sirte and people living in Tripoli, they don't necessarily feel that they're in the same bag together. See, you have to have this very strong sense, again, social imaginary, that we, all of us here, from the Egyptian border to the Tunisian border to the desert, form a collective agency. So very often you need a sort of national identity. See, there are all these aspects of social imaginary that if you don't have them, you don't have a successful transition to democracy. You have what we now call a failed state. Yeah, so, but let's go back to the feature that I've been talking about, how to have non-violent conflict. Both these. Not just non-violence, but non-violent, really vigorous conflict, harsh criticism, fist shaking at the other side, really terrible things to be being said about the crookedness or the inhumanity or the lack of vision of your opponents, and yet we have some sense that we are a unit, and that a crucial part of this has got to be like nonviolence. I mean, not letting it spill over into actual physical conflict. Now, let's look at the West after 1975. What did the democratic decay consist in, and why did it come about, and can it be reversed? Right? Well, I think you can see what it consisted in if you look at the structure of that kind of conflict in most Western societies, or the dominant structure. And the dominant structure was precisely a structure of elites versus non-elites. That is, parties grew up, Labour Party in Britain, Socialist, also Communist Party in France, Democrats in the United States, give or take very important qualifications with the regional breakdown of these parties, et cetera, et cetera. Social Democrats in Germany against the party which represented more the elites, and they offered the path. They supposedly offered the path towards moving the needle closer to the goal by undoing the various forms of elite rule, elite control, right? And thereby coming closer to the telos, to the goal. And they offered this in a number of ways: organized movements, trade unions, cooperatives, legislation redistributing income, legislation of welfare state kind guaranteeing certain income, et cetera, et cetera. And the mechanism of, let me introduce this term now, democratic efficacy, right? They were offering means of democratic efficacy to non-elites, of actually getting something done. Huh? Avenues whereby they could get their own interests, goals, aspirations into the mix with the adequate proportional influence. And so these were large parties, large ramifying parties, with sort of global programs which covered the whole waterfront. It covered fiscal policy, it covered the economic policy, it covered redistribution policy, it covered farm, et cetera, right? So you get two, in the ideal, typical case, there's always been complications anywhere, two large parties with two very large but different visions of where one should go, large but different programs of legislation and government. And there was a sense that with the changes that occurred in the United States starting in the 30s, but in Europe starting really after the war, there was a sense that, yeah, these were modes of democratic efficacy, and the proof was to non-elites there is, redistribution is occurring, greater influence is being exercised by popular organizations, and so on. So this is one of those periods in which democratic energy is high, popular voting is high, and you can see that it turned on a certain kind of democratic efficacy, of voter efficacy, if you like, ways of offering people the possibility of really having an influence. And this has, in fact, fallen apart. Now, why? Well, there are just all sorts of reasons why it fell apart. I mean, or fell apart is too dramatic. I'm always putting things in too dramatic terms. But I mean, it gradually disaggregated, it gradually ceased to be the way the politics was organized in those societies. One important reason for this was the rise of social movements. Things like feminism, rights of gays, people interested in ecological policies and so on, which were not necessarily taken up differentially by the two major parties, but were kind of outside the box. I mean, you could have socialist parties that were very non-feminist and not giving an important role to women. You could have popular parties that were not open to the demands of gays, etc. So you have the growth of these movements which take energy away from the older mechanism of democratic efficacy, which was, you want something, vote for the party that has that in its program, and it'll come about. Here you have people saying, no, don't put your energy into organizing the vote out for the Social Democrats or the Conservatives or whoever. Put your energy into campaigning for, propagandizing for women's rights, for instance, or getting court decisions rendered which help this movement along. See, and that becomes the direction of activity, so that so where the mechanism of efficacy up to then gets undermined. Or else you have, another very important contributing factor to this was the growth of what I've tried to call the ethic of authenticity, the idea that each human being has their own way of being human, kind of very strongly individuating idea, which again tended to break people out of these earlier solidarity of the workers and non-elites. And then that the force, if not the direction, of the ethic of authenticity is redoubled by the development of a consumer society where people begin to see themselves as expressing themselves by the kind of goods they buy. Nike shoes, just do it. Or I'm this kind of person because I wear these shoes, or etc. See, a very trivialized form of the ethic of authenticity, but it comes alongside it. Then you get, of course, the very large-scale change in the structure of employment in the labor force. Whereas in the early post-war period, you had domination of the labor market by regular jobs, permanent jobs, very often unionized in large corporations with fringe benefits built in, and health benefits, pension plans, and so on. Now you get a world of possible work in which there is greater and greater role. I don't know if this is true here, but this is true in West for part-time work, very precarious, not at all insured long-term. Having to move, therefore, very, very often. It's not like being a member of the General Motors workforce over several decades and retiring, with the retirement pension of the United Auto Workers, etc. It's something where you have to move and change and reinvent yourself again and again and again. Then you get increased role of what Saint Valon calls government, that is decisions in the narrow sense, decisions made not in terms of legislation, which is what you talk about in the general election, but decisions made day by day by government in a very much more complex society. Anyway, there's a whole lot of reasons why that mode of democratic efficacy begins to just be less efficacious. It's less of a plausible conduit or method by which I, as a worker, let's say, or non-elite, can have a real chance of, with my comrades, of changing the direction of policy. Well, now, what comes out of all that is a potential and indeed actual spiral down. The spiral down can be seen in several ways. But one way, I want to give three ways which actually interweave with each other. One is that in that kind of situation, you have a lesser incentive to vote. The idea that voting for this party is the way you're going to be efficacious doesn't seem to you to be likely, partly because it's making less and less difference in a world in which your options are before a very fractured labor force and set of jobs, precarious and part-time. Partly because it's true that very large unions which were integrated into social democratic parties were less interested in helping organizing these people, casual labor, so you feel they're less interested, so why should I vote for their party? Partly because you're into your authenticity. For a whole lot of reasons, there's no doubt about it, in all these societies, the level of vote goes down. Now, there are occasional blips up, but the level of vote goes down. And it's not as people like Putnam and others have shown, it's not just the youth vote less than their elders, but that's just not just a matter of life cycle. I mean, it could be that young people always vote less, and then as they get older and wiser, they vote more. But that's not what's happening. That part, maybe what's happening, but it's not most of what's happening. What most of what's happening is that a lot of the younger people who aren't voting today are never going to vote. You know, they lose the habit, and so you get the spiral begins to come in. Why the spiral? Well, because the reduction of the vote by non-elites. Remember, we're looking at West, not India. What's interesting is in India, that doesn't happen. But the reduction of the vote by non-elites means that the power of money in politics is all the greater, because people that don't traditionally or don't anymore habitually or as a matter of course go to vote have to be brought to the polls, have to be convinced to come to the polls. I mean, you increase greatly the importance of television and media in campaigns. That requires lots and lots of money, and very powerful moneyed lobbies step into this opportunity. So the power of money increases, but then it begins to look as though voting is even less of an interesting proposition, because you all seem to lose. I mean, in the end, you get perhaps the extreme case of this are certain U.S. Republicans that try to bring about a decrease in the vote of non-elites, like in Florida in 2000 and in various Republican-held states. They pass all sorts of laws requiring complex ID presentation in order to vote, with things like driver's licenses, which segments of the population that are non-elite are less likely to have. So they, even if they want to go to vote, they go to vote and they're told they haven't got the right to vote. Or you have, of course, the old American system of having to be registered. You're not registered automatically by the voting authority as you are in Canada and probably here, but you have to go and be registered, and then all these conditions arise. Well, you get this situation in which there actually are attempts not just to let it be that the non-elites don't vote, but to make it hard for them to vote. See? Underlying all that, of course, is a ideological sense of contempt for the citizenship of these non-elites, which you find justified. I mean, like Romney in the last presidential elections, talking about the 47% of Americans that just receive from the government and don't pay in. You see, so there is a set of spirals here in which the worse it gets, the worse it gets. The less there's voting, the less there seems to be any point in fighting the disproportionate role and influence of elites, and so the more there is disproportionate power for elites, so the less it's worth voting. Or you get the sense of, which also O'Donnell very much insists on, the importance of sensing that we are equal citizens participating together gets more and more difficult to sustain. I mean, at the limit, if you like. People on one end who live in gated communities and people on the other end who live in ghettos. Well, the idea that we are citizens together seems so strange and bizarre from either end of the spectrum. So all these things introduce a potential spiral where the destabilization of this earlier mode of democratic efficacy undercuts what seems to be any possible mode of democratic efficacy. There hasn't been a new mode, as it were, developed which can cope with this new situation. And so the result of all that, of course, is one result of all that is what I mentioned earlier, growing inequality, which again feeds in with a feedback loop here. The growing inequality seems to be something written into the nature of things, so what can you do about it? So don't waste your time voting. Now, it's very hard to stop this and reverse this, but there are reactions in the whole society which have that goal. And the ones that I want to talk about right now, particularly, are very famous. They're the famous public, popular movements and demonstrations of particularly young people that you saw, for instance, with Occupy in the United States, that you saw with, in Spain with the 15 de Mayo movement, that you saw in very many parts of the West. Young people turning out and saying, this is enough, we want equality, we want. But what is a little bit distressing from the point of view of a Democrat of these is that they too have very often bought into the idea that voting, that's not where it's at, right? So people asked the young demonstrators in Zuccotti Square a couple of years ago who were there occupying Wall Street and so on, well, are you guys going to register as Democrats and vote? What? What's that got to do with it? So you get all this energy, but it isn't in any way harnessed into the actual system, which is going to produce results. And you get a great deal of alienation, too. That is, among the young people, you know, all politicians are pretty dubious beings, and among the politicians, these kids don't understand anything from anything. See, you get this kind of mutual disdain, which keeps them from getting together. And indeed, what you get is something actually very interesting in these movements. They get very preoccupied with democracy and making it really effective. But it's the democracy inside the movement. See? They want movements which will really have programs that emanate from the base. Right? They want to get rid of all this elitism. But in some ways, the purer the democratic movement, the less it tries to engage, and therefore the less effective it is in changing the society. So you get, well, very interesting cases like this party Podemos, which means we can. I mean, a little bit like the slogan of Obama, yes, we can. But Podemos, we can. And it's a party which has made quite an impact on Spain in the last election, right there. They still haven't formed a government because they have a parliament which has not seemed to be able to make any stable coalition alliances, but that's partly because this new movement has erupted into the parliament. So that looks good because this energy is there connecting to parliamentary politics. But it's not entirely good because a lot of the people that were most energetic in the 15 de Mayo and these protest movements don't want to touch Podemos. They think of it as impure because they're now in this parliamentary game. Anyway, so there is this great, in a sense, crisis. I'm coming to the word, right? Because if this spiral goes on, it will delegitimate democracy to the point where all kinds of things could be done to it without people feeling that they're losing something absolutely so precious and so close to their identity that they must rise up and fight against it. I mean, I don't want to predict what happens at the end of the spiral, but it's not good from that standpoint of democracy. In other words, seen in the whole expectation, whatever, specter, or the whole run of modern history, modern democratic history, this is another one of those regressions, such as was created by the robber barons, such as been partly created here by the power of finance. And while the previous ones found a really adequate response, reconstituting the drive towards democracy, moving the needle back towards the telic end, towards the telos, it's not clear where that's going to come from. I mean, I have various ideas, I'd like to work on them and so on, but it's not, there's no guarantee that we will manage to do this. Now, here is where I want to widen, at the very end of my talk, I want to widen our as it were, perspective. I've been talking about the back and forth towards the goal, away from the goal of democracy, from the standpoint of social and economic non-elites, being disadvantaged, fighting back against it, and so on. But there are other ways in which people in one sense and people in the other sense can become non-congruent, not the same thing. The whole people on one hand, and the people who actually are there with interests and so on, can come apart. And that is by exclusion, by various forms of scapegoating, various forms of stigmatization of certain people as not really properly citizens. I mean, in a way, we already saw this with Romney's remarks about the 47%. It's like saying these people aren't really citizens in the full ethical sense of the term. But the way you most often see that kind of exclusion, alas, is on ethnic or religious or identity grounds. And in a great many Western societies, which are all becoming, we're always in some cases, like Canada and the States, or are becoming in other cases, like the European societies, immigration societies. By that I mean societies that are taking in lots and lots and lots of people who come from quite different cultures, and in theory, giving them citizenship and integrating them into the into the body politic, the democratic body politic. Well, we have here, in the present situation that we're living in the Western societies, as you can see in any day in the newspaper, real aggravation of this kind of exclusion. Underlining a growth of the popularity of the politics of exclusion in many of these societies. And this is also, of course, undermining democracy in the sense of the ideal of a democratic society in which the whole people is equally, all segments of it are equally served by, or equally, as it were, represented in, reflected in the policies decided by the government, by the parliament, and by the government. And what is particularly poignant at the moment is the way in which these two kinds of non-equality, these two kinds of imbalance, these two kinds of ways of not being at the ideal goal of democracy as I've described it, feed on each other. So you have in France today, to take an extreme case, people that belong clearly to the non-elites in a socio-economic sense, who are being induced to vote for the Front National, which is the party which wants to exclude Muslims, give them less rights, and not let them in, and so on. So you get failures of policy which have produced extreme disadvantage for socioeconomic non-elites. Instead of producing a pushback and trying to recover modes of democratic efficacy, you get blame attached to, well, it's all the fault of these immigrants, right? And so the energy that arises from that sense of being disadvantaged is grist to the mill, is feeding these exclusionary movements, which are growing everywhere. And even to our horror, a candidate for the presidency of the United States, which used to be fairly exemplary about anyway not admitting to any kind of exclusionary policy, is preaching that the U.S. shouldn't let in any Muslims until, I don't know exactly when, they all prove that they're not terrorists. So you get a terrible impasse in which the reaction to, or moving away from the ideal point of democracy in a socioeconomic sense, is aggravating another kind of move away, of deviation from the democratic ideal, and vice versa. Because what you get is that the people who are thus discriminated are tempted to sort of have an identity retreat and think of themselves, we're not French anymore, we're something else, and so we're exacerbating this conflict. Well, at this point, I'm just about to enter into the domain of my talk tomorrow. So what I think I will do is stop here, but it wasn't when I had correspondence with Carl Shaw and others about I didn't have in mind necessarily that the two subjects we chose would be, alas, so closely linked. It's really something that's come very much to the fore. But I want to talk tomorrow about the use of secularism, or in French, laïcité, as a weapon of exclusion, right? Not as an ideal of a state and a government that is not taking sides, is not identifying with one religion or another, but as a mechanism of exclusion. And we can see how the crisis of Western democracy, or crises if you want to call it, these crises are so imbricated, are so connected to each other, that there really is serious cause for very serious worry. In this kind of situation, see, the dream that many of my friends still share, that the world is becoming more democratic and is very hard to credit. So let me stop here and thank you for your very kind attention, and to be resumed, if one wants to go farther, tomorrow. Thank you very much. Yes. Shall I say? Yeah. But I mean, I have a mic, so it doesn't matter. I can stand up. I have a mic, you see.
Thank you for your talk. I'd like to begin with a comment and then follow by a question. A comment is that I was struck by your opening with the advantage of democracy as offering peace and order for the transition of powers. In East Asia, the people who dislike democracy, our Chinese neighbors, for example, like to point to the chaos and messiness and the consequent inefficiency of democracy. Yeah, that's one comment. But I of course think you are true if we look at democracy in its long history. And with my second question, I like to provoke with what I consider a deliberate caveat in your talk. Yeah. You are very gentle and modest, so you keep saying that my society and your society, and except the mention of Indian democracy, you will essentially stay quiet about non-Western democracy. And I imagine there is a reason behind that, because there was once an American president, George W. Bush, who wanted to bring democracy to Iraq, for example, and then once liberated, the Iraqis fought against each other and killed each other. So there is a general consensus among Western elite that don't mess with the politics of foreign countries, or you never impose a democracy on a different society. Yeah. But here in Taiwan, we went through a dark age of authoritarianism, and there were brave people who fought for democracy. And once they were prosecuted, they cried out for help. And a lot of countries, especially European countries, chose to ignore it. And once in a while, the United States would answer the call, and that contributed to the opening up of democracy in Taiwan. So I'd imagine today in China or in Russia, there are a lot of people who would like to hear from Charles Taylor say, yeah, we can do something about Russian and Chinese democracy, and we wanted to help. Essentially, I want to know what you think about the relationship between Western and non-Western democracies, and what role can Western societies serve for non-Western societies.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of very interesting questions here, but let me try to tackle them. Yeah, it follows from what I was saying about social imaginary, that the paths to democracy can be very, very different. What you see, it always builds on certain ways of operating that exist in the past there, but they get modified and turned and changed and help to build a democratic society. So the democratic society is going to look very different. I mean, I'm quite relatively familiar with the case of India, and it's very clear if you look at that from the standpoint of a Westerner. It's very, very different, different path here, and in which the important features of the independence movement was part of what helped build the Indian democracy we have. The big problems, really incredible inequality that, you know, of the caste system multiplied by wealth and so on, which, you know, in our worst worst nightmares we haven't equaled. All these make 3 different contexts. Now, why I stick to the Western one in this analysis is that I don't, with the exception of India, and that's partial, I don't feel I have real enough understanding here of what is going to make, what the path will look like. However, there are ways that we can help each other if there are kind of very obvious attempts by governments to stifle any such movement, as you see, I would argue, in mainland China today. As you see, well, in Russia, because they were farther ahead a few years ago and they're now going back. As we see in the case of the Ukraine, I mean, Russia's intervention in the Ukraine, and I agree with you in the necessity for this solidarity across all societies. We should all step in there, and I have, in various ways. But we have to distinguish between attacking or denouncing very obvious attempts to prevent any real internal development, on one hand, from knowing, sitting in my office in Montreal, what those internal developments, when they succeed, will look like. These are 2 very different things. The second kind of mistake here, the second, involves trying to sort of dictate to people in different societies exactly what their democratization will consist in. This is the blueprint of the Constitution, a set of rights and so on, and you start right off without any consideration of how they can get from here to there. So I want to distinguish between acts of solidarity which target clear policies which stifle any such development, on one hand, from prescribing from Washington or Ottawa or anywhere else what that movement will look like or ought to look like.
Professor, would you like to speak?
Yes. Oh, here we are, yeah.
先这个杨，黄教授，先等杨教授。
Oh, sorry. Okay. Enjoy your presentation. I'm a biologist, so I'm going to try to make an analog. In biology, there's a term at the cellular level, and we call it programmed cell death, meaning there's a program which will lead to cell death. And in terms of at the multiple organism level, it doesn't mean necessarily it's bad. For instance, if you have bad cells, which should die instead of turning into a cancer. So I'm going to say, in a very pessimistic way, I feel what you're saying, I understand you use different terms, and the decay, and so on. So I actually, honestly feeling there's a societal programmed death going on, just like you mentioned something. Just look at, as you said, in USA now the Donald Trump situation, which may be very good in terms of inciting people to be apart. So as a result, I feel from your talk, there could be one thing, which is we are going to have a real bad situation coming up soon. 20, 30, 40 some years, which is not a World War III, but it's starting already. That is, in every areas, there are those conflict, and most people get ignored. So would you agree or comment on, in such a real bad situation, worldwide? I understand there are many different ways of interpreting the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, some people may say it's so good about some democracy. Other people say it's totally baloney. So would you comment on this vast majority, and nobody is happy about what's going on? Everybody is bitching somebody else, and yet we say this is good. So my interpretation is now we're toward something which is really disastrous and which can really bankrupt, and then we renew from it. So would you comment on, maybe I'm too optimistic?
I see two things you might be saying. You may be saying both. One is, of course, we're facing as a planet really scary situation of planetary self-destruction. And are we going to be able to get our act together in time to do something about that? And I used to be very pessimistic. After Paris, slight optimism is rising. Okay. The second thing is whether what you're talking about is a movement in many, many societies in the world to increase to intensify elite rule, exclusion, and so on. And there, well, my friends always say, you're totally such an optimist, it's just so pathetic. And maybe they're right, or maybe I'm just following Gramsci, that pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But the fact that things are going in the bad direction now in many societies, things have gone in a better direction earlier. I don't give up the hope that things can go in a better direction again with certain kinds of leadership. And the right kind of leadership in these societies that are going badly, it exists to some degree, and it has traction to some degree. And it's not inconceivable that the disasters accruing to the other direction for everybody could make it the case that in many of these societies, this leadership will begin to be listened to.
Sir, you propose the theoretic conception of democracy.
Yeah.
And then you suggest that communism or the British labor movement could reflect the theoretic conception of democracy. My question is, first, would you allow Trump to represent your theoretic conception of democracy? And if not, must we return to basic idea of rule of law and commitment to equality when we speak of democracy?
Yeah, well, maybe we're talking across purposes. In a way, rule of law, which I'm absolutely agree is essential, and equality. Now, what is meant by equality? And there, I come back to what I call the theoretic conception, which I think is spelling out what is meant by equality. In other words, if the interests, aspirations, and so on of larger segment of the population are systematically given less weight, less possibility of being expressed in legislation, et cetera, that is not equality. There are other ways of denying equality, indeed, like the kind of exclusion of people on the grounds of their ethnic or background. But that I've been talking about in the Thiele conception, continuing these obstacles is not fulfilling equality. So I could quite easily subscribe to your definition, rule of law plus equality, but I'm insisting that one look more deeply into what equality requires. Now, communism is interesting because you're right, communists believed that they were fulfilling the Thiele conception. that indeed the only way in which there could be democracy and equality, in your sense, was by their road. I mean, plainly, that was a wild, maybe always improbable dream, certainly impossible to believe today when we've seen it in operation.
As a non-humanity worker, I view politics as public affair, which should compose two basic elements. One is representativeness. Second is welfare. Ideally, politics should have proper representation of the citizen, and that will lead to the long-term welfare. But in fact, it seems that the modern democracy emphasizes more on representativeness than welfareness. So my question is, do you see an intrinsic factor in building in democratic society that would guarantee long-term welfare of citizens? I think that's the goal of any politics system. But is it there in a democratic society or institution? That's my question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can understand your question, but maybe it's not in the way you intended. It's, in a way, what I've been trying to work out in the TD conception, or what are the conditions of its producing long-term welfare. And my argument would be that when you get the needle moving to the wrong end, as the way I've been describing, you're ensuring that the welfare of lots of people in the society will be not well served. And it goes farther than the examples I've been talking about. There's a very interesting book called The Spirit Level. I've forgotten the authors, but they make a series of studies of modern Western societies, including breaking the U.S. down into different states. The correlation between large-scale inequality and bad results for everybody, including things like health, which you think would be bad for the poor but good for. No. It turns out that large-scale inequality is bad for a whole lot of measures of welfare, right? So quite apart from the fact that it's differentially worse for some people than others, it's bad for everybody. So that is one of the reasons why I see moving the needle back in this direction as having a direct consequence in greater welfare for everybody, but particularly, of course, for the disadvantaged.
I think that lately we've seen the emergence of a new democratic imaginary as exemplified by cabinet building. So a new government gets elected and then selects ministers for its cabinet. And this phenomenon is best illustrated by the recent Canadian government. So it features maximum ethnic diversity. I think there's a Sikh minister, there's a ethnic Chinese minister, and in terms of gender relation, it also they've got to maintain quite a good balance. So, and yet these ministers are not non-elite. They've been to McGill. They don't mirror the different stratas of society, despite. So my question is: how do you regard this on with regard to your needle? Is this an aesthetic OP to produce more legitimization, or do you think it actually can produce any valuable results?
Oh yes, I mean the thing is that I thought maybe that's what you were getting at. Representativeness can be seen in two very different dimensions. One, the people out there in the parliament are like you, different kinds of people there, right? And the other is they're really channeling what is important for you and what you're seeking and what your needs, aspirations, and interests are. The second is the really important end result. Now, in a society which has suffered extreme imbalances between different classes of people or genders, or not classes in the Marxist sense necessarily, but different kinds of people, it may be a very useful measure in order to get long-term welfare for everyone to make, require of oneself representativeness in the first sense, which is what the young Trudeau did, right? That's exactly it. But the final criterion is, in the second sense, and one can't fetishize the first sense, regardless of its consequences. But in a situation in which there is this galloping exclusionary movement against immigrants from very different religions and so on throughout the West, very positive move. And in a situation in which we're very slow to give women the role they really deserve in various walks of life in society, yeah, it's justified. But you see, it's in terms of particular situations of unsatisfactory results in terms of meeting people's aspirations and so on, that this kind of, let's call it simple representativeness, or representativeness of likeness, can be considered a good act. It's not the ultimate name of the game. It's not. And so I applaud these moves by this government, yeah, but as a Canadian citizen, but no.
Professor, that's a very good lecture. I liked it a lot. Being from India, I think you can guess I have very specific interests about what you mentioned about the democratic, the differences in India. So I'd like to know a little bit more specific details about the study which you mentioned about a certain Banerjee, about the results, that is the difference between the voting demographies in between majorities and minorities in New Delhi. And the second thing I want to ask about is with the rise in social media, there's a lot of difference in the socio-political scenarios, because in India there are some studies which mention that there are more people have cellular phones than the number of toilets in the country. So, yeah, I know, it's funny, but that's the reality in my country. So almost everybody has WhatsApp and Facebook profiles, and even they use Twitter also. So I think the socio-political scene is actually changing very rapidly in India, and I think maybe if you could elaborate more on this, it could be interesting.
Yeah. Well, the author concerned is Mukulika Banerjee, and the book is Why India Votes, ? You're like, who's the publisher? I can't remember. But it's not minorities and majorities differentially voting. It is people that, in terms of their wealth, their education, and their social position, caste in the Indian case, but social position, are overwhelmingly in the West more likely to vote because they're at the top. It doesn't turn out that the imbalance is the other way, and women is against men, all right? So, and that's, this reader, she's a very good anthropologist. Read her book, you can, I think, see, but it's not simply based on her. A great deal of this work done by Yogita and Yadav and others shows these results of the differential voting. However, India, of course, is faced with the same parallel types of exclusion, right, that I've been talking about elsewhere. And the present governing party is cause for great concern, as far as I'm concerned, because of their really sort of Hindu chauvinist stance and their attacks on various minorities and their attempt to shut down discussion in universities. So I'm not saying it's an ideal situation. I'm saying that there is and maybe this will change for the worse, there is a degree of sort of energizing of the base in Indian society because of a sense that, yeah, we can move in this direction, which we don't have now in the West.
然后等一下讲。
Roy Tang from National Science University. I'm just curious about the methodological stance that you are taking here, because it seems to me that you are holding the view that modern understanding of democracy is oscillating between the two idea types, which can be identified as, Schumpeterian and Tadic. Well, and it seems to me that this point of view bears some resemblance to scholars like Isaac Berlin or Mike Rothschild for very different grounds, of course. As I mentioned to you over the lunch, I'm an admirer of you, and at the same time, I'm an admirer of Rothschild. Because this question is important for me, because it seems to me that you and Rothschild actually are representing the two ideal types of contemporary new Hegelians, skeptical and non-skeptical. So my first question is, do you agree with my observation? And my second one is that, do you believe, there is finally, a way out of the oscillation? Do you believe in a Hegelian reconciliation between these two, idea types in conflict? Thank you.
No, I'm not sure how you identify, exactly how you identify the Oakeshottian position. I feel close to him in some respects, but not in others. I feel close to him in his sense of the importance of culture, of political culture. But the second question I can answer clearly no. I don't believe in the idea of some kind of, I think that is a bit of Hegel, which I don't think one can really buy in the 21st century, that it all comes to some kind of reconciliation in which everything is brought together and nothing is left out and so on. In other words, I'm more like Isaiah Berlin in this regard.
Okay. There's one thing in your speech which is very, very striking. And I want to make sure if I get you right. You seem to be saying that the rise of social movement in the 1970s is one important contributing factor to the democratic decay, right? Because for the Democrats, the 1970s social movements is the golden age of democracy. People participate in social movements, struggling for minority rights, the women's rights. It's a high spirit of participation. But you seem to be saying that that kind of social participation take away the energy of democratic efficacy, right? So you seem to be assuming that there's an economy of social participation and political participation that you devote more into social movements, you kind of devote less to the normal political processes. I don't quite understand the mechanism why the social movements becomes in such a way of contradict with the democratic efficacy that you recommend. Because in Taiwan society, actually the relationship is actually between the social movement and the vote. They have very positive correlations. Right, you have high tide of social movements, and the political votes increase. It doesn't decrease. So I want to know the mechanism you observe in the Western societies that why the social movements actually become a contributing factor to the democratic decay. Yeah. Thanks.
No, one mustn't. I think this is maybe we need a bit more Hegel here. That everything that contributes to a development, that may be part of the causal background of a development, which is unfortunate. Is itself unfortunate? No. I think this is a great step forward when these issues that were previously put in the closet and not dealt with were dealt with. But it's like the whole message I'm saying is that situations are always changing and we need creative finding of new formulae, of new methods, etc., of rebuilding our democracy in the light of new situations. in the light of a situation where, for a whole lot of reasons, people lost faith in the democratic efficacy through the large umbrella party, we need another way of recovering democratic efficacy. It's not to say the only way of having democratic efficacy is that one, and we can see that democratic efficacy comes through very different avenues in different situations in the history of democracy, right? And so it's not something that you can just simply say this was working then, so it's good for eternity, and anything that upsets it is bad. No. There are some things that are very valid, but they have the consequence, along with other factors, of disrupting that form of efficacy. And the vote has gone down. I mean, these movements have become more and more powerful in the decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even reached some very spectacular results in the gay movement. And in those decades, in all Western societies, with a bit of up and down, the trend has been down. Participation rates have been down.
I may have to run a little risk of summarizing your argument as I understand it. So you diagnosize the crisis of Western democracies as I understand it, there's fragmentation, and there's polarization, and there's increasing economic inequality, and also increased felt citizen inefficacy. And at the end, you offer the solution, the comprehensive solution of equal citizenship. I can see that equal citizenship does offer part of the solution, but I'm not sure why it can be the whole solution. It sounds, because I think political polarization, fragmentation, a lot of times arise precisely because on the premise that we are equal already, but we have insoluble cultural, ideological, or conflict in interest. So it's not like when we are all equal that everything is solved. And it has to do with how we treat each other. So we are equals, but we can hate each other. So we are equals, and we can be alienated from each other. So you, at the end, I think you try to offer a thicker idea of equal citizenship. But I wonder, would you bring in other concepts, maybe just as important as equal citizenship, such as civic virtue from the Republican tradition, or solidarity plus equal citizenship? And I wonder, why do you not do this instead of just using equal citizenship to characterize your solution?
Well, I think that the cross purposes is created by this word of equal citizenship. I mean, I gave a certain reading of it, right? And it's not the solution. The solution is, my problem is, as we develop into a situation in which some people are more and more shut out, their interests, their aspirations, and so on, in which solidarity, precisely a very important thing, is sapped, because we no longer see ourselves as really like. As we move into this situation, which is the situation of democratic decay, what are the measures we can take? Now, I don't have, in a full-blown sense, the solution. I mean, what I said earlier about somehow linking the energy of all these Occupy and Quince de Mayo movements and so on with the representative system is the sketch of what would be a solution if we could find a way of actually doing it, right? So that is, my problem is that people are getting shut out more and more from the play of the representative system in taking account of them. They're more and more left to the side, either for these reasons that I'm talking about, socioeconomic reasons, or the other one, that they're deliberately excluded because of it. And this undermines solidarity, which I entirely agree is crucial. It undermines real Republican citizen ethos, which requires that you seek the public good, everyone's good, and not simply class or sectional good. And what we see happening with democratic decay is a loss on all those dimensions together. Less solidarity, as you can see in the remarks of Romney and so on, which resonate with a lot of people. These people are not really, they don't deserve our solidarity, our reaching out to help them. You get in that way, you get a loss of sense of the Republican virtue involved in citizenship itself, because you're willing to see all these goods are part of a package. I agree with you. So I'm looking for a way of restoring them and looking at the cause-effect relations and trying to see, and I don't have a solution yet. I'm trying to focus the problem, but I wish I had a solution.
Okay. I think time is up. Please join me to thank Professor Taylor again for his thoughtful talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.